our culture, as you're saying, has moved away from sort of statement architecture, and we're increasingly suspicious of that. But that's also not a new preoccupation. That tension has existed for hundreds of years, really since the beginning of the church itself. It I mean, there's just some really interesting debates you can look up, like Abbot Sujet and um, Bernard of Cluny. There are these two kind of French religious figures who were constantly fighting about how ornate should a church be versus how austere should it be, and what does it mean to be a Christian and to be responsible with the resources. And so this was, 1,000+ years ago when they were having these conversations, but it still strikes so true to
Wow, 1,000 years ago they were talking about this kind of stuff as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah, don't quote me on the time frame, but this was in the
Hundreds
medieval
of years.
era for
Yeah.
sure. And those writings are just as like invigorating and juicy to read today.
Yeah.
Um,
There's nothing new under the sun, it's all,
Absolutely,
we're
yeah.
still having the same
Yeah,
debates.
there's nothing new under the sun. So, it's interesting. This is a conversation that I have with architects, especially those who are believers. And we do find an interesting paradox in which we, as designers, part of our education is traveling and going abroad, specifically to places like Rome, to draw and study and sketch church buildings as a way to learn capital A architecture. And that's so core to our education. And yet we walk into these incredible spaces with rich history and also rich church history. And yet there's no effort to necessarily put the architecture in conversation with the theology. Um, Granted, most of these churches are operating as actual places of worship, but then in some cases it can be sort of museumified. And to the point where here in the United States, we have these really historic buildings that are more or less crumbling and have, dying populations, but they have some sort of historical designation that preempts the community from being able to sell or make any significant change or alteration that would actually enhance longevity. So that's one situation. On the opposite side, where I live in New York, some of the most thriving, growing young churches are renting. They're meeting in elementary schools, they're meeting in gymnasiums, they're meeting in sort of makeshift spaces that are not capital A architecture environments. And so the places that have the most architectural merit, those are for tourists or an aging population. And there isn't the kind of vigor that we're seeing in the younger communities that are renting. So it's
Yeah, it must be sad for you as an architect to see that sort of way of things, for the places that were created with such, great intentions, and are often the places that are receiving the least attention, other than people just want to take a picture or just look around and then leave again.
yes. Yeah. So it's definitely, I see it as not necessarily an issue. I'm keeping it in mind for the purpose of, architecture is always going to be a relevant and important firsthand source for any culture. So, what I mean by that is we have, when we think of history, when we think of like a history book, that's like a second or third hand source. But the arts, specifically art and architecture, are a firsthand account of the main preoccupations, dreams, hopes, fears of any given people group and who they were and what was valuable to them. And so the fact that our churches are no longer, how do I say this?
That place.
That place, just it's really more of a marker, more culturally, where we're at large, that we're not putting our money there because it's not a value. And not to say that churches aren't growing and that the gospel isn't still at work in the world. It's just that there's been a shift in terms of where the money is going and where the resources are going, because architecture is just extremely capital intensive. It's very cash heavy.
Hmm. It's such a there's such a theological conflict there. I mean, I was speaking with someone, another guest from this season of our show, and we were talking a lot about monuments and statues and things like that. And there's a whole debate to be had around, you know, statues that maybe were appropriate once upon a time, but are no longer appropriate, or are there, statues that refer back to values that we once really did prioritize, and now we just it seems like no one has a respect for those values anymore. And it seems like there's a similar kind of parallel there with churches, to where there's a real conflict between, do we go out of our way to make a monument dedicated to something that's, I guess you could say it's a uh, wasteful to in some people's eyes, to spend so much money on something that's um, temporal, and is not, I guess, directly winning souls. People want to see a return on their investment when they give their money to the church, but at the same time, there's that conflict between, I think there's an inspiration that comes from a grand space that can only be got from that type of, I guess when you walk into a cathedral, you just understand, or a church of any significance, that you understand the intent behind it, and it kind of connects you in a different way than going into kind of a darkened room with projectors. And I'm thinking of as well, you mentioned as well, post-war, there's a lot of that kind of rebuilding going on. It seems like it's been picking up pace recently, where cities, especially in Germany, I think it's Dresden, maybe, they have gone out of their way to really to bring back a cathedral that was in ruins. And I think of Coventry in England, which is still a ruin, but it's, they do certain things to kind of make sure it's still being used in some form. So perhaps there's a desire to go back. But how do you see that? I guess theologically, what's your opinion on? Do you think churches like that are worth building to this day? And just you personally?
Hmm. Well, you brought up the word monument, which I think is interesting. That that okay. I think it's important to note that the form of the church, specifically the cathedral, is something that was not core to the early church, like the apostolic church in Acts. Actually, the form of church architecture being what it became really started under Emperor Constantine in the 300s AD, when he sort of made Christianity the religion of empire, and conflated the aspirations of empire with the the overtures of Christianity. So the Roman basilica, which was a meeting house, it was something where the emperor would sit and have civic meetings, and the populace could gather, and it was very much a civic scale of a building. That was what became adopted into what we now know as the cathedral, and that has assumed really Christ as emperor, so that the conflation of empire and Christianity replaced Constantine and put Christ at the head. And so that's where you see all of the iconography, all the symbolism, the hierarchy, the linear, the axial progression from the narthex into the nave, through the crossing into the altar, and then culminating with the Christ head on the east wing. So, like, all of that has so much to do with a very specific lineage that really spun off onto its own. And so I'm hesitant to say Christianity was once this, therefore it should return to this, right? Because actually before that, it was an underground church that was in a primarily domestic setting, that was subversive. It was small, it was intimate, it was a gathering of neighbors who cut across many different social lines that met across difference, and didn't actually assume any one sort of architectural style. And so the architects I'm really interested in, so Inger and Johannes Exner, who I brought, initially pulled me into this whole world, their churches in Denmark were interested in that early church model, where they're interested in principles of equality and not hierarchy. They're interested in what is a purely democratic church environment look and feel like if it sort of got usurped by this imperialistic hierarchical regime that we see in really the Catholic Church with its very specific hierarchy and power structures. So they were interested in reclaiming the earliest, most democratic model of church assembly. So I bring all of that up because when you're asking my thoughts about, how churches should be maybe built today, I think there's actually so much precedent that extends outside of just what we think of as like a European cathedral. That, yes, so beautiful. We can all marvel, and I think there's something irreplaceable about a place that can generate awe and wonder, and especially in the vertical dimension, to make us feel just completely at a loss in terms of our scale in the universe and their scale compared to God. Like, that's just irreplaceable. But I think I'm interested the most in the smaller, more, say, democratic forms of church buildings that maybe are a little bit more humble, maybe take on a much more everyday material palette. They don't stick out in an urban environment. They're more subtle and introverted spaces that doesn't scream church. Like, there's nothing churchy about it, and yet you go in and there's something different. It alters your perception of what a church is and can or should be. And I think those spaces are fascinating to me because I think that reflects a really good architect who's grappling with what is a living church, what is a breathing, active church community that has a role in the modern world. And we don't necessarily need to copy paste from something that's happened in the past because that was of its era, that was so much of its time. And we don't, we are invited to reconsider the role of the church and the architecture of the church for today in the 21st century and the 22nd century. And, the church has always been at the cutting vanguard of architectural form. And why stop now? There's so much more technological progress that's been made. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that the church has yet to tap.